Okay, I guess we can get started. Thank you all for coming. Today I'm going to talk to you about open educational resources. I'm James Miller. I'm the Discovery and Sciences librarian. And I'm going to refer to open educational resources as OERs. Today I'm going to talk about how they can be a tool for equity and access. So I'm fortunate enough today to have a panel of Dr. Darla Shum, the professor of religious studies, global politics, and accomplished student, Sahin Mabuba, class of 2022, who had too many service things to fit on the slides. This is So what do we talk about? What do we mean when we talk about OER? The most basic definition, it's anything that's free to our students. So if you are posting journal articles that are free for your students to access on Moodle, or if you're posting links to ebooks from the library or streaming videos from the library, anything that's free is OER. So if you're doing that, that's fantastic. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the impact OER has. The textbook definition of OER is a little more involved. It's basically any teaching or learning resource that either through being in the public domain or having a license that allows people to access it at no cost. So that's the more technical definition. But you may be wondering what's the issue with, well, you may not be wondering, what's the issue with commercial textbooks? Why is OER at a leading edge conference? Commercial textbooks are really strange consumer item because the price of their price increase has outpaced inflation. And you can see this chart only goes to 2016, but you can see the blue line is commercial textbooks. So it's this really strange consumer item that just keeps going up and up in price. And you can see the line at the bottom is basic inflation. That's a consumer price index. So you can see that it's rapidly outpaced it. And I get asked this question a lot, what's the average cost of a textbook? It's anywhere from $80 to $150. And so yearly expenditures for a student can be around $1,200 from what I've seen. So again, why would I talk about open OERs at a leading edge conference? I think they have potential as a tool for social justice. We've seen how the cost of textbooks are rising. And although there are some rental options for students and there's some possibilities for digital downloads, which make the textbooks a little less expensive, and we are giving more financial aid, sometimes those financial aid packages don't cover all the costs of required readings and required texts. So that's where OERs come in as an option that levels the field a little bit. They're free to everyone. And this access issue that's what connects to the equity issue. And we know that there's inequities among students, between first-gen students and students whose family have experience in college. We also know there's differences between white students and historically marginalized students. So OERs are a way to try to level the playing field because everyone has access, everyone has the same level of access. How else can OERs be seen as a tool for social justice? It can give faculty more control over their content. So it can do with the pedagogy, and it allows faculty to customize their content. If what they're getting from the textbook isn't current, they can seek something out. I've also seen some cool projects where students work with faculty to create OER content. And when someone releases an open textbook, it adds more diversity to the curriculum and it's out there for everyone to use. So what do we know about the research and the scholarship with OERs? I'm going to go over 3 studies really briefly. And basically, there's 2 academic outcomes I'm going to look at. End of course grades, and then the decrease or the withdrawal rate. So these are classes where they compared a class year that had open textbooks and the class year that had commercial textbooks. So there's a study, University of Georgia, I think there were about 10,000 people in each cohort. And they found that the use of OERs increased the course grade for all students at the end of the course. They also saw a decrease in the withdrawal rate for all students. And some of the studies, they'll look at a demographic that has the greatest impact with implementing OERs. And they saw that in this study, the Pell Grant recipients or low-income students and historically underserved students, that's basically non-white students for this study, they had these positive outcomes at a greater rate than other students. Positive outcomes meaning better grades and a lower withdrawal rate. I did look at a meta-analysis, which is a meta-analysis is a statistical analysis of studies where they try to combine all the findings. So there was one in 2019 that looked at end of course grades, and they looked at 21 studies, and they saw no difference in grades. And the way that the authors talked about this is they said, this shows us that open textbooks are not significantly better or significantly worse than traditional textbooks. They also looked at the withdrawal rates, and they looked at 11 studies and saw that the withdrawal rates were significantly lower in classes that offered an open textbook option. Because there were so many studies in this meta-analysis, demographics weren't something you could tease out from the meta-analysis. There was also a Houston Community College study that showed that all students had a higher end of course grade. However, it did show that there was a decrease, there was no decrease in the drop or withdrawal rate, so it had no effect on completion. Open textbooks didn't change how many students dropped the class. This study had a demographic component, and it showed that Asians had a statistically significant impact when things were open textbook, things were available open and free, and that there was nearly a statistically significant trend for Black students. However, the study didn't find any kind of Pell interaction with low-income students. So I'd say the take home for this is, or my reading of it is, if you offer a class with an open textbook, you can either expect higher end of course grades, decrease in the withdrawal rate, maybe one or the other or both. And students that fall into those demographic groups are going to perform at a better rate than they normally would with a commercial textbook. So let's talk about Hollins students and just how our demographic breakdown is. And this is fall 2021 data. So about 36% of Hollins students are Pell recipients, so low income. And 32% are first generation. We had talked about the differences in equity and access between first gen and students whose family have experience with college. And then for non-white, about 36% of Hollins students are non-white. And again, that was demographics that were teased out in some of those studies about open textbooks and the positive academic outcomes. More recently, VIVA, which is the Virginia Academic Library Consortium, they put out a survey called the Virginia Course Material Survey. It was about 70 students took the survey. It was a representative sample. I'm going to go over some of the results and then also share some of the quotes from Hollins students. How worried were students about meeting their course material costs? About 1 in 4 were extremely worried, a third were moderately worried, and about a quarter were slightly worried. This is just a student quote. The cost of course materials has made me find other ways to access the material, either by sharing with a classmate, finding it online elsewhere, to not getting the material at all. This can impact my learning experience because it can affect the time I have with the material or just add extra stress. They were also asked how often the cost of textbooks caused them to just flat out not buy the book at all. And about 1 out of 4 students said 25% of the time they don't buy the book at all. And then around a third said they occasionally don't buy the book. So here are some other academic behaviors from the study, again, that was on Hollins students. In your career, has the cost of textbooks caused you to not register for a specific course? About 7% said frequently, 16% occasionally. Take fewer courses, about 15% said occasionally, 1% frequently. Then earning a poor grade, There's about 8% split between occasionally and frequently. So here's some more Hollins voices. It, calls the textbooks, has caused unnecessary stress and resentment towards the education system for continuing to heap costs onto something that should be a human right. Yeah. The cost of course materials stresses me out since it's an addition to the high tuition I already pay to go to university. It makes the education I want to get less accessible since I often try to find alternative courses that don't have additional course fees in them. Now, this is one I want the faculty to sort of meditate on. So have any of the following large decisions been based at all on the cost of course materials? About 1 in 4 said that the cost of course materials were an influence of what major they selected. So that ends up, what that means is the major you select, your career trajectory can be influenced by just seeing what the cost of course materials are for a major and then deciding to go a different way. And there was also a 12% response for the cost of these materials affecting their choice of minor. So I have a few more Hollins quotes, and I'll try to get to the more cheerful part of the presentation. From our Hollins students. I didn't actually buy the book required for my prerequisite classes and often read summaries off of the internet for class discussion because I could only afford to buy books of my major. More than once, it's forced me to take up another job, taking away time from doing my coursework, making it harder to keep up with what's happening in class. It has held me back from taking more courses and doing school clubs because I need to work. I haven't been able to buy any of the course materials and I've had to use other people's books and computer programs. There's other data in the survey that I can share with you if you're interested. I'd be happy to email the data. The survey also talked about students' print versus electronic preferences. Which would they rather have for a textbook? It leaned a little bit more towards print. Also, students' motivations for buying versus renting a textbook. And then it breaks down the demographics. And then for a section of the students, it talks about the effect of having to hold a job on their academic success, what effect that has. So this is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question because it's not. Why hasn't everyone switched to OER? It's not simple to do. It takes time. You have to, as you know, you have to revamp your course planning to fit with this open textbook. And there isn't one place for faculty to look when they're interested in open textbooks, although I'll share a few places that you can look in the next slide. What I hear from a lot of faculty is that with the commercial textbooks, they come to rely on these homework programs that are included and the slides and the ancillary materials. And not all of those materials are available with open textbooks, so that can be a downside. The other piece is money. They need to pay more experts for creating these open textbooks. You may know that sometimes it's institutions like Rice or MIT, they pay scholars to write open textbooks, but there's a limited amount of money for that. And just honestly, I think that, it's not on the slide, but I feel that faculty should be compensated as well for adopting an open textbook, for taking the time to reshape their course to fit an open textbook. And that would be a way to incentivize more faculty to adopt an OER. Money also comes into play with the library somewhat. I know there's a Gender and Women Study ebook. It's $850 and it only allows like 3 users at a time. So occasionally you have an outrageously expensive book like that. But for the most part, ebooks are a good choice. It comes down to the access models. If everyone can access the ebook at the same time or not, if it's a model that provides less access. Here are a few places you can start your search. I probably would pick the Virginia Tech Guide as the place to start. That's generally what I share with people because it's an extensive website that has sections by discipline. It also has a lot of different places you can search. That's why I found a few different things for faculty. And some of these you may already be aware of. What role does the library play? We're trying to help. We can meet with you, we can consult, searching the collection to find something that fits your needs. We can order new materials, of course, ebooks to do quite a bit of that. And I've tried, and I know this isn't comprehensive, and don't feel offended if you're not on this list, but I've made a web page that compiles every faculty who I've spoken with that's using an open textbook. And it puts it into a spreadsheet or kind of a table. And I started this in 2016. And you can see some of these faculty are no longer here. Like Kennedy was a math faculty that's no longer here, but she was a juggernaut with open textbooks. And then other folks have been steadily using open textbooks. And again, this is not a conclusive look at what all faculty are doing to reduce costs for students. What questions do you have for me about any of the topics I covered so far? I'll answer those, and then we can shift to some panel questions that are more general. Yes?
I'm going to implicitly say this is more of a comment than a question, which I don't know here, but I think that my instinctive reaction to this is that it puts this burden or this feels on faculty for resolving a problem that is
systemic.
Why? I agree that some textbooks are ridiculously expensive. Those are not ones that I use in my courses. But why can't we figure out how financial aid could support students on these books? Or, gosh, the millions of dollars that we just got, I don't know if it's possible for some of that to be allocated to helping students buy books. I think about a class I'm teaching this semester that uses role-playing games, and there are specific texts. I can't find a substitute for those things, but I also know it's a burden for the students in the class. And I had departmental funds to use to buy food that most uses rotating copies for students who take it. But I guess I would appreciate sort of helping us think a little bit about not just faculty, students, what can faculty do to change this, because we're and more what other institutional things can we do to help students support.
I don't like giving these kind of talks because it does feel like a combination of me trying to sell life insurance and warning you about drunk driving or something. It feels like we're trying to guilt you into something. I agree that the textbooks, there are other programs where textbooks are covered by financial aid. And when I talk about putting textbooks, open textbooks, more in the ecosystem, I know that every class, it's impossible for every class to have that. I think having a sprinkling here and there in gen ed or at 100 level classes would be helpful. But I understand that, I saw the graph from the faculty meeting about the tenure track positions, and the faculty, this is another thing to heap upon them. That's why I also think that creating some incentive structure for faculty who are interested in it would help, maybe in tandem with some kind of financial aid that would cover it. So I appreciate the comment and the insight. And I think that taking a bigger approach to the structure, maybe via financial aid, would be maybe a more constructive place to start.
I think it's good to get people to think about the positive things, and that's really important. I think you highlight some, I used to assign a modern Europe textbook that after a while, it's this is ridiculous. They're not reading all of it. It's costs so much money to make change editions constantly. So I think those issues exist, but I appreciate what you're saying. A more expansive conversation.
Right. Any other questions about the material before we move to the panel? And for this panel, I have questions for Zaheen, and then I have questions for Dr. Shulman. Feel free to chime in with your own experience and your own insights. So I'll start with Darla. What got you interested in the concept of OER, zero cost materials, and did you have any hesitations?
So I have to start with a confession, which is I stumbled into it, and then became a proponent. So what really got me thinking about this issue was I taught a first year seminar in the fall called Disabling Ableism. And as I was designing the syllabus, I was being very mindful of universal design principles, which that's a different panel probably to delve into what universal design is. But very briefly, it comes out of the disability rights movement and is the idea that, well, in our context, that the classroom experience, the syllabus, the course should be designed in such a way that any student is able to access the entire course. So that starts with the literal built environment, so the classroom space, to assignments, to course readings, and from A to Z, basically. So as I was designing a course about where and how ableism shows up in our world and on our campus, I started to think about access to the course material. I actually contacted Rebecca in the library and said, okay, I'm trying to figure out, I only had 2 books. One was a big anthology and was very, very expensive. And I started by asking Rebecca about finding copies of that book to put on reserve. And Rebecca came back to me and said, hey, I did a search and this is available as an unlimited use ebook. Would that work? And I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't think about this. So I'm here as a representative of someone who has used OER sources, but I do have to say that it was because someone else, I was that horse that got led to the water and then I happily drank. And then I sent an email right back to Rebecca and said, of course, that's fantastic. What about this book, the second book that I was using? And I lucked out. That book was also available as an unlimited ebook. So what I found in that class, and a lot of what James was talking about a moment ago, I don't have any way to substantiate my suspicions, but it seemed pretty clear to me that most of the students were doing the reading most of the time. And I cannot say that for all of my classes. I had good engagement with the material, class discussion, and I frequently I've had students come to me the 3rd or 4th week of class and say, I haven't bought the book because I can't afford it. And I'm sort of, a month into the class, I become aware that they haven't been doing the reading. And of course that didn't happen in this class at all because I had the link to both of the books right in the syllabus and everybody was able to access it. So the short answer, and I just gave a very long one, to James's question is I both came to this through the principles of universal design, but also because Rebecca was very on the ball and very helpful.
Thank you. And a student question. Zaheen, have you taken any courses with 0 costs for required texts? And then what was your experience as a student in one of those courses?
Yeah, so I'll kind of begin with my experience of what OER meant to me as a first year student. So coming from some of the populations that James mentioned, people that come from lower income households, that come from, parents who haven't had a proper quality education in a setting of the United States. So I was coming in, even with, because of, maybe I know you mentioned financial aid, but the package looks different for so many people that sometimes, asking them for money for books is not a possibility. So that was the case for me, where I couldn't ask for money for books on top of whatever financial aid I was receiving. So it was actually kind of instinctual to kind of figure out, what I can do to minimize my costs, because as an international student, you can't have a job on campus for first semester. So there were so many other barriers that kind of led me to figuring out how can I afford some of these classes, right? So I remember during my first year, I would actually email my professors for the classes that I had registered and ask them, what are the flexibilities regarding textbook policies? Would you want, can I use a PDF? Can I use a used textbook, or do I have to have a textbook if I can find excerpts of the pieces online, right? So that was one of my ways of figuring out which classes or which, I guess, class demographics would provide kind of zero cost materials that I can attend. So I figured out in my department, which is the International Studies department, a lot of the textbooks were kind of based on a lot of the readings from online. So I would figure out the readings online and still come to class with the same amount of knowledge that the textbook would give, right? So eventually I started speaking to my professors and figuring out other ways, if they can photocopy the textbook for me or chapter the textbook for me, because I couldn't basically afford them my first year. So my experience again was because it is from the background that I come from, and again, I think to me it has been more positive. I have dropped some classes because I realized that that's not feasible for me. And again, it's also depending on my priority. For example, I'd rather pay $200 for a set of books for my political science class than I would for a physics textbooks that I'm going to take for 1 semester. So again, I think my experience with OER has been positive in the sense that I have been able to figure out sources on my own, of course, with the help of our library loan system, which I have been using extensively. If I'm honest, I bought 2 textbooks since I've been in college because of our library loan policy. And that to me is something that I pass on as well. This is something I was able to talk to my students about, because being a part, our class for our first year seminar was very experiential, so it didn't require a lot of reading. But a lot of the students in that class were STEM students, and we know that STEM textbooks can, sometimes cost up to $300 for some students. And I thought for them, they were deciding to change majors in that sense. So I think from a personal standpoint, working with these students, and from a personal standpoint, from having to find out different ways on making sure that I don't have to pay excessively for my textbooks is something that I think is important to discuss given the communities we have on campus.